Well, welcome to everyone. We have a live audience with us, and we also have a Zoom audience, so we'll see how this goes. But this is our first presentation of a series that we're calling Diversity Saints, and we're looking at the diversity of saints that we have within the Catholic Church. So if you look at the tapestries around, you can see a variety of saints that we're celebrating. So today, we're celebrating Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, and we're delighted to have Dr. Michelle Jacob with us. We'd be even more delighted if she was here in person, but nonetheless, this is the best we can do given the circumstances. Anyway, welcome, Michelle. Michelle is a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Oregon. She's the director of a teacher education program. And she was the founding director of the Center for Native Health and Culture at Heritage University on the Yakima Reservation. Michelle is a member of the Yakima Nation herself from Washington State. She has several publications to her credit, including Yakima Rising, Indigenous Cultural Revitalization, Activism and Healing, The Anti-Way, Story, Celebration, Kindness, Fierceness, and Creativity, and Huckleberries and Coyotes, Lessons from Our More Than Human Relations. And for our presentation today, most significantly, is her very important work called Indian Pilgrims, Indigenous Journeys of Activism and Healing with Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. So Michelle, we're delighted to have you. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Jeffrey, so much. I was really grateful to be invited to present today, to share with you all. And just huge thanks to Jeffrey, CCTC at USD for inviting me as hosts on Kumeyaay homeland, a place that's special to me, where my husband and I spent many years as I was previously faculty at the University of San Diego, and have lots of dear friends and colleagues there. So a warm thank you and greeting to you all. I'll go ahead and introduce myself in my Indigenous language, Ichishkin Sinuit, as I was taught. So I'll just greet you with a simple Shich Pachwai, Ikna Shwaniksha Michelle Jacob, Washna Shakamaknik. And so I just greet you all, have a good day. And I'm letting you know that I'm a member of the Yakima Nation. And behind me, I was asked earlier, what's your background? That's a photo from my reservation taken in Toppenish, where my mom is from. And later I'm going to read you a little story talking about root digging time. And that story, as I experienced it, took place on Toppenish Ridge. That's the ridge there, the brown ridge in the photo. And of course, in the Northwest, we have beautiful mountains. Or I should say, we belong to beautiful mountains. And so there's Fatu Mount Adams, a sacred mountain to our people there in the background. And so I'm very happy to share with you who I am and where I'm from. I'll go ahead and share some slides today. My mom always says, share lots of pictures in your presentations. And so in honor of her instructions, I've got slides with lots of pictures, and I do have a link where you can download the slides if you want. You can download them and look at them, take your time, look up the resources, even share some of the resources with your friends or colleagues. And so I'll share that link at the end where you can download the slides. So let me get my screen share on. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about my book, Indian Pilgrims. Here it is. I got a picture of the cover later in the slideshow. Of course, it's a book examining the importance of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. That's how my people pronounce her name. I've been taught that in Mohawk pronunciation, we would say Gatali to Gatawita. I say Kateri, because that's how I grew up hearing about her, and that's how I talk to her. I have a little Kateri candle. It's an battery-operated candle that I got at her shrine in Canada, where most of her remains are, and enjoy visiting with a Mohawk woman running the gift shop there, and brought that candle home. And so I light that at night, just in Thanksgiving, and also to pray for healing for family members and friends who are, needing some help to be well. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Saint Kateri and how she's an important auntie figure. I've blogged about that. I'll share my blog link at the end, how she's a super auntie to many Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, Catholic and non-Catholic alike. And so she is really an important Indigenous feminine figure who allows us to reclaim the Indigenous feminine as sacred. And so that's what I write about in Indian Pilgrims. It's really an Indigenous feminist analysis. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I understand there are some students who might be attending the event today, and you're probably going to be expected to write something about the event. And so something I would love for you to take with you as you do your assignment, and really for the rest of your life, is that bolded question there on the bottom. How are you, or will you be, in respectful relation with Indigenous peoples? You know, in the flyer that Jeffrey put together for this event, he had two questions. Who is Saint Kateri Tekakwitha? Why is there a building named after her on campus? And so first of all, I'll note that there's a building co-named after her on campus. I honor and respect that the University of San Diego chose to add Saint Kateri's name to a building, but they couldn't quite take Junipero Serra's name off the building. And so that's an interesting move, right? And it tells us about the values, about historical narratives, about Indigenous presence and place. And, as we look at San Diego, there are so many ways Junipero Serra is honored. So many. My goodness, we would struggle to count them all. And yet the building name must be shared. So I'm just noting that in case that thought didn't cross your mind yet. So anyhow, today I'm going to talk to you about Indigenous cultural teachings. And there are many, many Indigenous cultural teachings, too many to name, across tribal groups, places. But there is something that is common across Indigenous cultural teachings. Number one, relationships are important. And number two, we demonstrate that through our respect and responsibility. And what I mean by that is that we're braiding together respect for ourselves, respect for our human relations, and respect for our more than human relations. And so there are many ways that you can learn from Indigenous scholars. I'm going to share some resources today. I'm sure you can find many more. And so I just feature on this slide a beautiful award-winning book by my dear friend and colleague, who's the co-director of our Subsequently teacher education program, Alutiiq scholar Leilani Subzalian, Indigenous Children's Survivance in Public Schools, where she really asks us to look at education and how is indigeneity framed? Is it there? Is it absent? What is the experience of Indigenous students? What is the experience of non-Indigenous students, right? How have you learned about Indigenous peoples in your K-12 education? How are you learning about Indigenous peoples now? It's so important to know where you are. You're on Indigenous land. And that way you can begin that process of being in respectful relation with Indigenous peoples and place. Then I also have the On Indian Ground book there. And that's a book in a series led by my friend and colleague, Dr. Jolie Proudfit at Cal State San Marcos. And there's a book that covers every region of the US. So I was fortunate to be a co-editor with Dr. Stephanie Running Hawk Johnson for the Northwest edition. There is a California edition that is out as well. And so you can learn about Indigenous education in whatever region you're from, or whatever region you plan to move to after you're done with school, and certainly where you are now. San Diego is the perfect place to learn about Indigenous peoples. There are more reservations in San Diego County than any other county in the US. So I can show you a link later if you want, if it comes up in Q&A. There are some resources on the USD webpage where people have done some initial work to try to, gather up resources for you so that you can know where you are and on whose land you are. All right, so in the book, Jeffrey asked me to talk a little bit about this. I won't go into great detail because you can read more, certainly if you're interested and you think it will be helpful for you. But in the book, I talk about what's going on with Indigenous communities. And I frame that in terms of two cycles that are happening simultaneously. One is a cycle of destruction that's fueled by colonial logics. And in that cycle, I write about this settler colonial logic that Indigenous peoples in ways are heathen or less than. And that certainly, was the case historically. We see that today still in some ways. And so that belief, that logic really drove this process that has led to profound Indigenous language and culture loss. And then there's an overarching belief of Indigenous culture as inferior. All right, so that's a cycle of destruction. There's a literature on historical trauma that I draw from too. We can talk more about that later if you want. But Indigenous scholars are really critiquing scholarship that looks at Indigenous peoples as victims, as damaged. That's quite often the narrative about Indigenous peoples. So we can't stop our analysis there because that itself is damaging, right? Where you just stay in that trauma, because that's not all we are either. And so in the book, I also write about a cycle of healing. And I frame that in terms of resisting colonial logics. And there's so many beautiful examples that I talk about in the book. The activism within which people engage is just fabulous and affirming. And so I write about ways that St. Kateri really inspires people. And we see that in many examples of Indigenous cultural revitalization. And then, as I mentioned earlier, reclaiming the Native feminine as sacred, right? If you follow Indigenous peoples on social media, you'll see that there's a lot of attention on missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? Calling attention to the fact that women, girls, boys, two-spirit individuals are mistreated, harmed, killed, and oftentimes there's no action taken, right? So that our people's lives are sacred, and really reclaiming and restoring those understandings, those way of being, those relationships, and demanding that the institutions that serve our people start from that perspective, right? That our lives are sacred. All right, so that's a bit about the cycle of destruction and the cycle of healing. And so in the book, I talk about St. Kateri as a powerful presence. And we're coming up on the 9th anniversary of her canonization. I was very fortunate to be able to go and to witness that beautiful process and to meet so many people, primarily Indigenous people, but many non-Indigenous people too, who had just been waiting and also advocating and praying for St. Kateri to be canonized. In many Indigenous families, they have been praying for that for generations. And so she's definitely a hugely important figure across tribal peoples. And this is interesting because this is happening, of course, within an institution that was a colonizing agent, right? And so there are these rich contradictions that we can examine when we look at the life and the symbolic meaning of St. Kateri to Indigenous peoples. St. Kateri is the patroness of the environment. And so in the book, I also talk about Indigenous environmentalism. And I talk about 4 main components of Indigenous environmentalism. One is that we have a spiritual responsibility to protect Mother Earth, to be good stewards, to make sure that we are preparing the way for the future generations to have a healthy existence. Number two is that we need to listen to our tribal elders. They have long experience and relationship with the land. They know things and have perspectives that are so incredibly important. Number three is looking downstream and looking upstream, right? To have that sense of who's gone before us and who has gone after us, this generational teaching, but also that understanding of our environmental impact, right? That we are connected. What we do is impacted by whoever's upstream from us and whoever is downstream from us. And then finally, embracing allies who understand the shared responsibility of protecting Mother Earth. And so to really see where are our shared interests, where can we work together? Where can we understand each other? You know, I am an Indigenous feminist scholar, and I know my history of feminism, and I know that Black feminism has made Indigenous feminist scholarship possible. Black feminist scholarship really opened up space for Indigenous feminist scholarship. And so Indigenous feminism is very deeply indebted to Black feminism. And so I love reading Black feminist scholars and returning to their amazing writings, including Audre Lorde, who writes about the importance of respecting differences. And so I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have the exact quote with me right now, but the idea of you don't have to be me to understand me, right? And so I'm giving you today in my talk examples of Indigenous cultural teachings that I would love for you to learn from and share and carry with you. That's not saying that you become Indigenous if you're not an Indigenous person, but it's about respecting difference and seeing, where can we collaborate? Where do our interests come together? Where do we see our beautiful futures intertwining? And so that's a point that I would love for you to take with you from my talk. All right, so I promised you to talk about Indigenous cultural teachings. And so there are several ways that these happen. I'm going to share with you today some important examples of elder pedagogy, obviously Indigenous feminist pedagogy, and storytelling pedagogy. So I'm not going to read you these little quote squares that I've made that share some key examples from some other work, my work and all cool other Indigenous scholars as well. But I'd love to engage with you around these pedagogies right now through just a very short story that I'll read you from my book, The Anti-Way. And so I invite you just to sit back and listen and soak in this story that takes place on Toppenish Ridge. You can see behind me. Oh, that way you can see behind me. And, you know, think about, what do you take with you from this story? And the story is called I Love Pirche, which is bitter root in our language. I love Pirche. She's bitter and strong and difficult and beautiful. She's grounded, fierce. She makes you kneel or stoop. She thrives where pretty much no one else will. She makes you pay attention. She's holy. She teaches us the power of the collective, literally. Folks, have you ever tried to dig and peel an entire gunny sack of pirche by yourself? Yeah, you're way better off filling a station wagon full of people to come help you. It doesn't really matter who. Anyone willing to learn and help makes for good company. Pirche teaches us this too. By the time we stop for gas, wind our way up the ridge, and bounce down that rutted, rocky road, we're all so grateful to be there. The petty annoyances, the sibling squabbles, the long-held grudges, the arguments about who ate too much garlic last night or too many sunflower seeds this morning, that all just drifts away. I think the brisk spring wind took it. So grab a cup and digging tool and breathe in that fresh spring air. Enjoy the sunny morning, that gorgeous contrast of the biscuit-colored earth meeting the blue, blue sky. Literally. I went to Home Depot and looked at their paint chips. The exact shade is called sky blue. I never tire of that view, the golden colored earth meeting the crisp blue sky. I remember Auntie helping teach us to dig, her scarf neatly tied on her head while she prayed to Creator and blessed us before we dug our first roots. Often when we dig Pirche, we can see the dip of Sada's Pass in the distance. We have fond memories of journeys taken that way and great hopes for future fun to be had. That's the way to Tijuana, the big river, Columbia River, and to Portland with its tax-free shopping malls, trailblazer basketball games, and the steakhouse my dad sometimes treats my nephews to, a place with all you can eat meat. Can you imagine? On a Pirche digging day, there is no time for such things. We are alive and at peace with ourselves, each other, and all the world. Even after all these years, Auntie's blessings remain intact. We renew them, and I believe the wind carries our prayers back to her spirit. I love Pirche. All right, so in that story, I share with you some elder pedagogy that I was fortunate to learn from my auntie, that you teach through doing. If gathering traditional foods and being in respectful and prayerful relationship with place is important, you take the children there and do that. If praying to the Creator to give thanks for food that has sustained our people since time immemorial, you demonstrate that, right? You model that. And so that's really precious teaching that I was fortunate to learn and that I have shared with you. And I think everyone in this Zoom call, we're all really caught up in education, right? Western education. That's what has brought us together today. And it's important. And so one of the things that I want to leave you to think about is, what do I see modeled in my institution? What am I modeling for others? I work with students who are training to be teachers, and something I like to remind us is that we're always teaching, whether we know it or not, because people will learn from us what's important. People will learn for us how we think humans should conduct themselves by how we model that, right? And so that's really empowering, kind of way of viewing the world, that I'm always in charge of teaching anyone who's around me. And so I just ask us, what are these institutions that we're in? How are they set up? What are they pushing to the forefront? What's left back or unnamed? Who's not at the table, right? So I've gone on and on about the importance of elder pedagogy, and I want to ask, in our educational settings, do we include elders? Do we always have that opportunity to learn from them, the precious teachings that they carry? If so, great. If not, well, then maybe that's a change that could be suggested, right? All right, then just a quick note about Indigenous feminist pedagogy. I wanted you to notice that our sacred food, pirche, is gendered in the story, right? And so then we see built into our cultural teachings, the feminine is sacred, right? And if we hold on to that teaching, Indigenous women and girls will always be valued, right? And then finally, storytelling pedagogy. My favorite is sharing stories. Oh, I love all these three, but I especially enjoy storytelling pedagogy by sharing, teaching, and learning with story. All right. So to call our attention to Indigenous feminism, I've quoted some amazing Indigenous feminist scholars there in the quote squares, which I won't read for you. But in our pursuit of reclaiming Indigenous ways of knowing and being, we want to hold on to this idea, this truth that I would say as reclaiming Indigenous, the feminine as sacred, and that we're honoring our commitment to respect and responsibility by offering a generative pathway forward. And this is really taking on that responsibility that we don't just stay stuck in that trauma, but that we also look at the cycles of healing, the incredible resilience that Indigenous peoples are engaged in by honoring our teachings, and that we become part of that, right? All right, so I've talked about land. You've seen the pretty picture behind me. I want to show you some maps now to demonstrate the importance of an Indigenous perspective in our learning. So here's a map. And there's Yakima Reservation. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but the large reservation there in South Central Washington State. And this is a map of reservations in the Pacific Northwest. It's a map that I have used as a source from the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. For context, the school that I work at, University of Oregon, is here in Eugene on that I-5 corridor. Have you ever cruised up I-5 all the way up to Oregon? And you'll note the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon and their reservations. None of them are in this economic center of Portland, Salem, and Eugene, right? That's of course intentional from settler colonialism, pushing Indigenous peoples' lands away from the economic centers, right? So the University of Oregon is on Kalapuya homeland. Kalapuya peoples were forced off their land, which we now call Eugene. And many are now members of the reservation-based tribes of Grand Ronde and Siletz that you see there in Western Oregon. So here's a map. It shows you reservations, which is important because a lot of maps don't show you that, right? It becomes whitewashed settler colonial geographic representation of place. And so within this map, you also see the Columbia River here. It's the border, many people refer to it, between Oregon and Washington. If you know our people's history and our traditional economies, you probably wouldn't call it a border, rather you would call it a coming together place. I think that's a really important teaching, especially as you think about where you are, those of you watching on Kumeyaay lands there in San Diego. What would it mean? What would it look like if we looked at borders instead of places of division? What if we looked at them as coming together places? They wouldn't be places of violence. They wouldn't be places of fear, right? So I think that's a really important question to carry with us. I'm going to show you another map, actually a couple more. Here's another map of the same place you just looked at, but holy smokes, it's really different. How is it different? I think you all are good Zoom participants who have muted yourself, so I'll answer for you. You'll see the different colors here. This is a map from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, of which my tribe is a part. Those are our sister tribes there. You'll see first, I think, the colors. So we saw that dark purple was represented here. And there it is there, but there's this larger lavender place, right? And so that's our ceded territory, the land that was taken from us in that treaty making process with the United States government in 1855. And so over 90% of our land was taken in that treaty making process. And more of it has been taken since then with related to other legislation like the Dawes Act that allowed for the allotment of that dark purple area that was in the treaty reserved for our exclusive use and purpose. But the US Congress said, oh, no, 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 we want to open up more land to settlement. And so now that dark purple area, some of that is now outside of tribal ownership. It's private land, like you would see in cities and towns and so forth. So that's another discussion, but this is just to point out that when Yakima peoples look at this map, we're, oh yeah, there's a reservation, that's good. You know, people know where we are. That the picture behind me, that's taken from there. Yeah, good. But then we also know that's not only our homeland. The Lavender area, that's our homeland as well. And then of course we traveled outside of those borders to trade and you know, to have fun. Horse races, gambling, etc. in our histories, which our people do still enjoy. And another striking feature of this map, I think, is the dark tan area. And that's the Columbia River Basin. So that dark tan really helps us to see that one river brings us together with so many peoples and lands, including the Pacific Ocean, right? And so this is much more of an indigenous cultural perspective of looking at place. We see connections, we see our ancestors, we see the strength and presence of our people, right? And so that's just an example of how when you do learn about indigenous perspectives, a whole nother way of looking at things opens up. And that's why it's important to have indigenous studies in the curriculum, right? That's why it's important to hire indigenous faculty. I understand USD is at a crossroads right now without a full-time tribal liaison, but with plans to hire, you know, first perhaps have an interim and then to hire. I understand there could be a search happening in the spring for a full-time tribal liaison. I invite everyone in attendance today from USD to think about, what's my responsibility to support the work of a tribal liaison? If you don't know the answer to that question, that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers. What I'm asking is that you ask the question and consider it and try to move forward in a respectful way, right? How many of you have taken a class from a Native American professor at the University of San Diego? From my understanding, I believe there's only one or two indigenous faculty there. So, you know, there's a gap. You know, the students are being denied that opportunity. And so that's something that you can raise, right? The institution is accountable to you. And so you can rise up and make your voices heard if that's something that you find to be important. All right, I've got one more map. So this is a map from the US government showing American Indian reservations. You'll see the little dots down there in San Diego County. Those are actually overrepresented because the land base was just gobbled up through settler colonialism. And so tribes in San Diego have reservations and strong cultures, but you know, are always working to get their land back, right? And so this map, I think, is important because, of course, from an indigenous perspective, that's all indigenous land, right? That's all our indigenous homeland. It's all purple. But then we can also see there are real outcomes of settler colonialism, right? And so I've been inviting you throughout my talk, especially folks from USD, to think about, well, what does it mean to be a person attending school on stolen Kumeyaay land, right? There is a land back movement. I can share a link with you in the chat when we get to the Q&A and discussion part. If you don't know what the land back movement is, you should check it out. There's really important information, beautiful set of principles by which organizers are expected to conduct themselves. And yeah, Indigenous peoples, we want our homelands back. And we also understand that that's a complicated process. And so there are other things that Western education systems can do to share power, right? So that Indigenous peoples have a seat at the table. Indigenous students are supported, right? And so I'll give you now some examples of what does that look like. All right, so at the University of Oregon, as we mentioned, I co-direct our Subsikotla teacher education program. Subsikotla in Itishkin is teacher. And so we name our program in Indigenous language. And so whenever anybody talks about our program, they are forced to use Indigenous language. And that's awesome. And that's something that our people are very concerned about, is addressing that part of the cycle of destruction, right, that took our language from us through education as an example of colonial violence, right, that punished and beat Indigenous children for speaking their languages, shamed Indigenous peoples for speaking their languages. And now we're addressing that through a cycle of healing by bringing our Indigenous languages back into schools, right? How beautiful would it be if USD had Kumeyaay language in culture class? Oh, that would be amazing. I actually went when I was a faculty member and took a class at Kumeyaay Community College to learn Kumeyaay ethnobotany so that I could be educated and share that with my students there. But what if that was on the USD campus? That would be such a gift to everyone. So in our Subsequent Law program at the University of Oregon, we have a motto that guides our work, Subsequent Tui Nami Tanamamia, that was gifted to us by elders. And that is the motto that guides our work. Education strengthens our people. That's why we do our work. That's how we do our work. Always thinking about how is our work as educators, strengthening tribal nation building. So just tell you a little bit about the program. It's long running as a consortium with the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. And so what that means is that we have quarterly meetings with representatives from all of the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. The reps are appointed by their tribal councils, and we do all our planning, our policy making, and our admissions process through a consensus-based process with these tribal education leaders. So in other words, tribal peoples of Oregon are in charge of advising us, of affirming the admissions decisions. Like all of that power is shared, right? And admission is a big deal because we not only want to recruit students, we want them to be fully supported so that they are successful. And so we're a rigorous 12-month graduate program. So our students, they earn their master's degree and teacher licensure. And we apply for competitive funding from the US Department of Education. We've been very fortunate, and we put in a lot of work, so we've been very successful in a track record to get large funding to support students every year with tuition, books, fees, living stipends. They don't have to work when they're taking their classes, and if they have children, dependent stipend as well, right? And so that's to make sure that these precious students, Indigenous students who are training to be teachers, who are going to serve in Indigenous serving schools, so that they are fully supported. And we're really proud of our 104 Indigenous alumni, all of who have served their Indigenous communities. So earlier I talked about elder pedagogy, and if you're a good critical thinker, you might say, okay, well, how do you bring elder pedagogy into subsequent law? That'd be a great question. And so we do that through having a distinguished elder educator position that Dr. Sabzalian and I created, and that we're so blessed to work with Tchamshish, Dr. Virginia Biebert. And she attends our seminars, advises us, provides support to students and faculty and staff. And she also speaks at events for students. And so here's a beautiful quote, more elder pedagogy for you, from Tecumseh's graduation speech that she gave. And I'm going to read this one. Love each other, take care of each other, be good to your land, take care of it and all those who walk on the mountains, the four-legged, those that swim up the river from the ocean, all of these things that grow in the mountains, the berries and roots that feed the people, that fed them from time immemorial. These things shall not be forgotten because they are still there. And it's important to discuss this with the little children and also college students anywhere. So here's a wisdom sharing from Tecumseh. And I'll pause for a moment and let you soak that in, and also make a note of what are you taking from that? And maybe in the Q&A discussion, you can share what you're taking from that. All right, Tecumseh is an elder in residence at the University of Oregon. And she's also a world-renowned scholar and linguist. Here's her book, The Gift of Knowledge, Tutnui Atoashinchi and Shimami, Reflections on Sahaptin Ways. She's on the cover there. She's the little girl on the cover. And there's a beautiful story that she talks about in the book where when she was that little girl, they were up picking huckleberries in the mountains. And she and her cousin, I believe it was, another little girl, they got lost. And they were lost for a while, like days. And they did okay because they knew the foods, they knew the mountains, and then they were reunited with their family. And that's when this photo was taken. And she says that she had all purple face from eating huckleberries. And so Tecumseh, she turns 100 years old in November. And yeah, as you saw from earlier slide, she's out there helping students. She always says, I don't know everything, but I'm happy to share what I do know. And that's such a generous way of being in the world, always teaching, like I said earlier. So there's a link to our subsequent flow program if you want to learn more. We are recruiting. If you're an American Indian or Alaska Native person who wants to if you're going to graduate this year, you want to go on to a master's, or if you want to come back to school and get your master's in teaching license, or if you know somebody who wants to, have them reach out. We would love for them to apply. All right. I'm at the point where I get to decide how much more do I want to talk. All right, I'll try to keep it short. All right, so this is just for all you people out there who are having a hard time. The world is crazy. There's so many inequalities, brutal injustices. You're right, there are. And we are surrounded by beautiful teachings. If you know the place where you are at, you will know that you are always surrounded by beauty and by strength and by power in the land. That's another wonderful reason to be in good relationality with Indigenous peoples. All right, the Indigenous paradigm is so important. All right, so I'm going to share one more little bit from my work. This is from my book, Fox Doesn't Wear a Watch. There's the cover by this cover and anti-way cover that I showed earlier. It's by Yakima artist Crystal Buck. She has amazing artwork. Isn't that beautiful? All right, so I'm going to share a little bit from this book, Fox Doesn't Wear a Watch. In the book, I really think about Mother Nature's classroom. And if there was a syllabus for learning in Mother Nature's classroom, what would be on that syllabus? And so I share in the book that I think the important learning outcomes would be, 1, be in respectful relation with place. 2, honor all of my relatives, human and more than human. 3, continually demonstrate caring, connection, and love toward myself and all beings. 4, conduct myself in ways that affirm I am a good ancestor to future generations. All right, and I think I'll start winding up so we do have time for discussion. So to conclude, our Indigenous cultures and stories contain precious teachings. They connect us respectfully to place and uphold the values that have sustained our people since time immemorial. I think a place of prominence in any education institution would be really good for such an approach. And then my question, as you know already, that I'm asking you to take with you forever and ever, how are you or will you be in respectful relation with Indigenous peoples? And then as I wrap up, I just want to thank you in my language. Thank you all for listening. I'm so grateful for our sharing and learning time together. There's my personal website that I folded there. On there, there's a free resources page where you can download these slides. And again, I made all those little quote squares. You're welcome to use those, to share those, however it's helpful for you. And then, yeah, there's my other info. Oh, and on my website, you can buy my books too that are there with Crystal's beautiful artwork on there. And the author royalties go to our subsequent program. All right, I'm going to wrap up there and open up the space for comments and questions. I warn you, if you ask me a question, I'm going to ask you who you are, where you're from, and why you're asking the question so that we can be in relation with each other.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. So we have a crowd of students there and some adults. So if anybody would like to ask a question, you just raise your hand and we'll have you come up and you can ask your question on Zoom here. I want to go back to something you said earlier in the thing, just to bring it back to Saint Kateri. And that is, you mentioned Kateri as an auntie. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, oh, thank you so much for asking that. Yeah, you know, auntie figures or auntie, depending on your pronunciation, they have such prominence in our Indigenous communities. Yet within dominant culture, you don't see or hear that much about aunts, not to the extent that you do in Indigenous communities. And so Saint Kateri is somebody who a lot of Indigenous peoples think of as kin, right? That she's a relative. An auntie figure can be somebody that you look up to, who inspires you, who believes in you, whether you're blood related or you could have a chosen auntie, right? Somebody can become your auntie. And so that it becomes like an honorary title, right? Or an honorary relationship. And so, yeah, as I had mentioned on my blog, I have a post about something about super auntie Saint Kateri, right? That she's there for you. She's looking out for you. She wants what's best for you. Those are the same traits that we use to describe our real aunties, who help us and encourage us and inspire us. Saint Kateri also, through, and you can read more about her in my book or even on a quick Google search, but taking a vow of perpetual virginity, right? She doesn't have descendants in that way, right? And so that's another way that she becomes an auntie to so many of us.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to ask a question? We have Kathleen Ross is raising her hand, but Kathleen, if you could type your question into the chat room, chat feature, we'd appreciate that.
Oh, okay.
No, you can speak. Okay, go ahead and speak.
Yes. Thank you, Michelle, so much for all the insights that you provide into the way of life that Kateri lived, as well as our other Indigenous people. My name is Sister Kathleen Ross, and I'm a Holy Name sister. And I live on the Yakima Reservation and privileged to have lived there for a number of years. I guess I have my other connection with Indigenous people is that my father grew up in Penticton. He was not from an Indigenous group, but the priest that was there was very welcoming and helpful to the local people. And my father would get on his horse to ride out to the little mission church to help with mass there. So thank you, Michelle. My question is more just on the level of more sharing as you have done. I'm wondering if there's any specific story from Kateri's life, from the way she experienced her life and had to live it, that is especially an inspiration to you. And if so, could you share that story with us?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross, for being here and for sharing. And I want to also share with the group that Dr. Ross, we mentioned Heritage University on the Yakima Reservation earlier when Jeffrey introduced me. And that institution of higher learning was co-founded by Dr. Ross, who worked with 2 Yakima women to create Heritage College, which became Heritage University. And so that's a school that's on our homeland that serves our people. I have a nephew who's graduating from Heritage University this year. And so it's just been such a gift to our people. So I just want to acknowledge that and to thank you. Yes, thanks for your question. So I'm not a historian, so historians tend to look at St. Kateri, some people say Kateri also, or Gatali, as I had mentioned earlier, and they're like really try to find out like what was her life really like and what was she really like and so forth. That's not, I'm trained as a sociologist, so I'm more interested in the meaning that people and places and culture have. But I will share that it's documented that St. Kateri was very devout, and she was also very determined in her worship, in her spiritual focus. There are written accounts of her, harming herself, right, as an act of penance. Way up, what we now think of as Northern New York, Southern Canada, Quebec area, very bitterly cold, right? Going outside and walking barefoot, right, as a sacrifice, as a prayer, and doing other acts of what we would now call self-harm. And so, I share that when I talk sometimes with students or young people about St. Kateri is, what does it mean when we look at this Indigenous girl, really, right? A teenager who's doing self-harm, who becomes this amazingly important spiritual figure for millions of people. Now think about the girl in your community who's harming herself. What do you think about her? What's the narrative there? Is it like this victim, disempowered, sorrow, waste? I've heard young people like troubled, right? Those are often narratives that we hear, that sometimes we even use or think when we think about young people. What if instead we were inspired by St. Kateri to say, wow, that young person, there's like a strength and a focus there that, gosh, if we could get them to, perhaps use that in a different way, they could make such an amazing difference, right? So that's something that I think about. I think about St. Kateri. And I think there's also a narrative about her, she was had very poor eyesight, and her face was, what they say, disfigured because she had smallpox when she was very young. And her parents and her brother died. And so she was orphaned. She lived with an uncle who was a leader. And her uncle saw, disease, saw rapid change that was happening with colonialism, was not an advocate for the Catholic Church, amongst Indigenous peoples. That's what the written accounts say. And so then they talk about, most of the narratives talk about Saint Kateri like fleeing her oppressive uncle, right? And so I think that's an important moment. Her uncle's often described, in the historical records as being heathen, right? And so that's an assumption we want to challenge, of course. And so I think that example from her life, I think there are two things that I love to take away from that. And one is to really look at the position her uncle was in, right? If you were in the position where your whole family and community was just being annihilated, right, by disease, got these newcomers are trying to act like they know what's best for everybody, right? How would you respond if you're in a leadership role? And then the second thing I love to take away from that is, instead of the focus being on Kateri fleeing an oppressive uncle, what if we think about gosh, what agency she had, right? To say, what, this is the life that I want. I see I have choices here, and I'm going to make a different choice rather than staying in this village and being married and having children, which was the expected pathway of her life by the written record account. She's like, no, I'm going to do something else. I think that's an interesting and inspiring example. And it's not often crafted in that way in the historical narratives. So yeah, thank you so much for the question. Great. All right. So I know we've got 1 minute left. If anyone wants to share.
We have a last question here by anyone?
Or comment. You don't have to.
Or comment. No, they've taken a pact of silence. So
I have a comment.
okay, go ahead.
Tom Reifer, I just wanted to say that we love you and miss you, Dr. Jacob. And it's so wonderful to hear you. And I just am very grateful for you. Thank you.
I'm grateful for you too, Tom.
Thank you. But that is a nice way to end the presentation. So thank you very much. Again, if you'd like to read more about Indian pilgrims and St. Kateri, you have Michelle Jacobs' book. You can see that. So I encourage you to get that and read that. And we have St. Kateri in our tapestry here in the I'll try to give you a panoramic view of the room here. So anyway, thank you very much. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you at another event. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, everybody who attended on Zoom.